about what we mean when we talk about land degradation. It's defined as a negative trend in land condition, basically a long-term reduction or loss in at least one of the following aspects of land: biological productivity, ecological integrity or ecosystem status, or value to humans. And effectively, desertification is the same as the above, but expressly applied to dry land. So desertification is land degradation in arid, semi-arid, and dry subhumid areas. There are commonalities in the sense that both land degradation and desertification are caused by both direct and indirect human activities, and that's the predominant causal factor for land degradation. And climate change can contribute to those things. And one of the focus of these two chapters particularly was to try and decompose or attribute the impact of climate on land degradation and desertification. And I'll get back to that in a second as to how much we can say about that. I'm going to start off the talk with the key points that I take from these two chapters. The rest of the talk will be unpicking some of the processes in between, and then I'm going to end with what I think are 3 challenges and a key take-home message from these two chapters. So first of all, these are serious problems. Land degradation and desertification are serious, they're global, and because they affect people, they affect livelihoods, they affect food and water, and they affect ecosystems as well, ecosystem health. So globally, they affect anyone and everyone who lives on the planet. So they're complicated because there are multiple causal factors that contribute to them. There's no one single mechanism that we can definitively say this contributes to land degradation or desertification. And this makes it complicated, and it makes it challenging to try and unpick what causes land degradation and even to particularly pinpoint climate and climate change as a particular driver of any land degradation instance. So a key from this is that even though it contributes and it's complicated to unpick, it is a threat multiplier. So notwithstanding everything else, when climate change is added to the picture, it does make the threat so much worse. There is some good news that I take away from these chapters, and that is that land degradation can be avoided, reversed, and so in the sort of humid, non-dry land areas, possibly a little bit easier, can be avoided, reduced, or reversed by focusing on sustainable land management practices. And those sustainable land management practices may provide a lot of co-benefits to adaptation and mitigation of climate change from carbon capture and so on. Desertification, in my opinion, is harder to reverse once it's full-blown. Sustainable land management practices combined with indigenous local knowledge can increase adaptation. But I think in dry lands, they're so much closer to the edge, if you like. They're so much closer to irreversible land changes that I think the focus should be on preventing as opposed to reversing. Both land degradation and desertification exert feedbacks on climate through changes in surface properties, changes in vegetation and soil and land surface, and CO2 emission changes as well. So for me, these are my headlines, and I'll come back to the challenges and how we would improve this in the future, what we would take away from this in improving our understanding of these mechanisms. So just to orientate ourselves where global drylands are and non-dry lands are in the world. So all the warm colors are the drylands. So from yellow to red are from the dry subhumid to the hyperarid. And you can see that they occupy over 40% of the global land area, not an insignificant part of the world. But importantly, they're home to over 38% of the population, close to 40%, about 3 billion people, 90% of whom live in developing countries. And that's the key thing here. These are the people, these are the populations that are reliant on marginal lands and already degrading lands. So the gray are the non-dry lands. They're not just humid, they're humids, they're tropical and cold. And this is where the chapter on land degradation refers to. Now, land degradation, desertification, and climate change, both individually and in combination, have profound effects mainly on societies which rely very heavily on the land and on rain for their livelihoods. And we can envisage huge components of the population that rely on rain-fed agriculture, on groundwater, livestock, pastoralism for their livelihoods, and so intimately linked to the land, its productivity and its status. So once you degrade the land, you're effectively taking away livelihood sources, vegetation, food for animals, food for people, and so on. So these are the populations most at risk of the impacts of land degradation and desertification. Drylands in particular support over 50% of global grazing lands. And what we see here is that as the climate shifts from the dry subhumid becomes progressively more arid, we see a decline in productive croplands and basically a corresponding increase in pastoral lands. And in many countries, many dryland countries in particular, that are reliant on pastoralism, the livestock production makes up a large percentage of the economy, contributes to the GDP of the economies, and particularly in East Africa and so on. Pastoralists make up a huge percentage of the population. So disruptions in land productivity, increasing in degradation, really disrupts these economies and these livelihoods for these populations. So here is a breakdown of the dryland areas by continent. We see that Africa and Asia have the largest percentage of dryland area. And then if we look at the breakdown of that population by continent, we see that most of the population is in Asia, of course, and most of the global population is in semi-arid lands. And then you can see the difference in the current population, or the 2010, versus the projected population for 2050. And you can see the increases in these different dryland biomes. So importantly, estimates by the UN are estimating more than 3.2 billion people around the world are currently affected by land degradation, and more than a quarter of the global land surface is being affected. And that includes drylands and includes non-dryland areas as well. And again, projected that the global economy will lose something like $23 trillion by 2050 through land degradation, through affecting land-based economies, livelihoods, and so on. So just a quick kind of presentation of the drivers of land degradation. The first one, which I think is probably one of the most common, is overgrazing. And again, pressures of livestock and livelihoods that dependent on pastoral activities may result in overgrazing. This is frequently one of the most cited factors that contribute the most to desertification and land degradation. So, you can imagine that as pressures on the land are shifting through increasing degradation, there's less and less available productive, fertile land for grazing, and this exerts more and more pressure as livestock is forced to concentrate in different areas, and that basically feeds back and accentuates the problem. The way that this works is that effectively cattle that are just ripping up vegetation, eating it, induce basically gaps in the ecosystem, and then that results in a series of feedbacks within the landscape that perpetuates land degradation through erosion and nutrient depletion. Another cause, of course, is land misuse, harvesting, illegal harvesting for fuel or over-harvesting for fuel, vegetation, and this is a big problem in East Africa, illegal chopping of acacia trees for export, large-scale and small-scale deforestation that removes the vegetation, and again, that kicks back into all these feedbacks that the land doesn't recover from very quickly. And of course, on top of all that, climate change through aridification, through changing in intensities of storms that can basically accentuate these cycles of vegetation change, erosion, nutrient depletion within the landscape. So again, it's like a kind of add-on that makes the whole thing, the threat, much, much worse. So the consequences, which are the most important thing, of course, are that, first of all, ecosystems change status. We see a dramatic shift in the type of vegetation cover, an increase in the amount of bare soil, change in the land surface properties, and in drylands in particular, this can be considered irreversible over long time scales. So this is a big problem for the landscape, of course. For humans, a decline in land productivity and food production. So soils become infertile, they decline in nutrient status, and their ability to produce food declines. And in some parts of the world where resources are already pretty limited, this can accentuate conflict, or it can even lead to new conflicts arising where people are basically fighting for limited resources. And combining dramatic shifts in land productivity with climate change can result in migration of various populations in search for more productive lands and better living conditions. So these are not trivial. They have ginormous impacts on food and water security around the world. The most undernourished populations in the world are these three here: Sub-Saharan Africa, East Africa, South Asia, with around 30% of their populations being undernourished. And of course, this is a kind of combination of progressively degrading lands, climate change, which increases frequency and intensity of droughts, and the populations are unable to recover and adapt to these incidents. And the degraded land as well, once degraded, once desertified, impacts the water balance. So it's not just food, but it's how the surface changes and how it affects the water balance and water availability through altered vegetation cover, soil properties, and land surface properties. So it's both food and water both affected. So climate change comes in. I'm using an example here from East Africa where the early 2000s saw a dramatic increase in drought incidence and severity, leading to many famines in the region, where it's a combination of conflict, of drought, and of land degradation, which basically decreases social resilience and reduces the capacity to adapt and recover. So increased frequency, intensity of droughts, the change in rainfall, which may accentuate cycles of erosion, and so on, all basically accentuate and compound the impacts of an already degrading landscape. So the impact on the SDGs, this is from chapter 3, this diagram. The bars here indicate the magnitude of the impact, so the bigger the bar, the higher the impact. And the color scale indicates the level of confidence. So the main ones, the main SDGs that are impacted by desertification are no poverty and zero hunger, so poverty and hunger through the mechanisms I just described, as well as climate action and life on land. And these are the obvious how these come about in this way. Now I want to end the talk and the last few slides with what I perceive as the challenges in going forward with the work that's come out of these chapters. And one of the take-homes from, for example, chapter 3, is that it's actually incredibly challenging to quantify land degradation and desertification at the global scale. So we have at our availability, of course, satellite remote sensing technologies and metrics that we can put together at the global scale. But of course, the problem is global in that it is occurring globally, but there are multiple causal factors, as I mentioned earlier, and so this makes it challenging to find a metric or to compile a global synthesis of desertification and land degradation. So because these can manifest in the vegetation cover, in the soil, in the nutrients, in biodiversity, in agriculture, and so on, most of our available metrics right now don't do that. They typically focus on vegetation greenness, NDVI, or some other kind of metric of vegetation health. And so one of the challenges in going forward is that this is a global problem, but perhaps we need to start thinking more locally about how we measure and quantify the problem in various locations. The second challenge is that it is challenging, I'm saying it's hard, is it possibly impossible to attribute particular causes such as climate change to land degradation and desertification. This is because of the multiple interacting drivers and the underlying causes, which are social, political, they're cultural, they're economic. In various countries and various contexts, these things manifest in different ways. Land use, grazing patterns, deforestation, climate, and also the way that land is managed. And all these things impact the land at different timescales, which makes it very hard to try and really pinpoint what's causing what at different times. Everything starts to basically add up. So I think it was a laudable goal to try and find the kind of how does climate change affect land degradation, desertification. I think both chapters conclude that it's very challenging to do this with the current mechanisms operating. And finally, my third challenge is that yes, land degradation and desertification, they are global problems, but they possibly need characterizing and addressing at local scales. As I mentioned at the beginning, sustainable land management and indigenous local knowledge are very important for improving the way that land is managed, for sustainable grazing patterns and so on. But in many parts of the world, in fact in many dry lands of the world, conflict is present, and conflict can be a driver in itself of degradation. It forces changes in habits and indigenous ways and practices that can't be done anymore. So it forces grazing to take place in non-restricted areas. It restricts access to land. It changes people's livelihoods. And so I think, these kinds of issues, we need to start to think more realistically about how do we implement sustainable land management in conflict-ridden drylands of the world where these things are challenging, where people are suspicious and lose trust. And these images here show you that even conflict itself can have a direct impact on the land. It can disrupt the soil surface, break up the soil crusts. And this is showing you some images of illegal charcoal deforestation in Somalia. So these are real issues on the ground, which if we really want to have an impact, I think the issues of political instability and lack of governance have to be also factored in. Okay, and so to end with the key points is that attribution of land degradation and desertification to climate change is hard, if not impossible, but it is a threat multiplier for sure. And it does exacerbate the impacts of land degradation and desertification on people's lives and livelihoods. And this schematic from chapter 4 on land degradation shows how the cycle of land degradation, declining in agricultural productivity, forcing more uses of natural resources and land and kind of increasing the cycle. But then climate change comes on top and it does exacerbate this decline in productivity. It does increase the sensitivity to climatic stress. So on a positive note, though, to end, this is my final slide. Again, from chapter 4, this diagram basically shows this is a scale of land management from sustainable in green to unsustainable in red. The red arrows are showing you the direction that climate change is pushing towards sort of forcing the land towards more degraded states. But it's kind of showing that with appropriate restoration rehabilitation measures, we can withstand the effects of climate change. And I think that is the point, that actually land-based influences of humans, of grazing and so on, have a much bigger impact on land degradation, desertification than climate change alone. And therefore, if we focus on restoration rehabilitation, then the effects of climate change can be counteracted. And this shows the impacts on the carbon stock and on the carbon sink, the net carbon uptake. So clearly, the goal is to move towards a less degraded state where we increase our carbon stocks and increase the sink in forest and agriculture. So the message here is kind of like, well, it's more up to human beings to counteract the effects of climate and climate change. And that's it. Thank you very much.
The different areas involved. Again, maybe time, let's squeeze one question in. If you're quick on the draw, please quick on the draw with a question. If you're not, yes, right. Yeah, just hang on a sec for a mic, please, if you would.
Hello, thank you. I enjoyed that very much. The point you were making about conflict and the other, its flip side, I imagine, is corruption. Mm-hmm. Are there any measures for this? Is there a way of assessing how this impacts the whole scene?
I think there's a lot being done on this right now. And it's a very good point. Corruption, basically lawlessness and people distrusting, even if there is a policy on the ground. It's kind of the tragedy of the commons. In many parts of, for example, East Africa and other areas that traditionally have flourished under, dry conditions, it's things like conflict that make the move towards non-resilient strategies and unsustainable strategies. And that's why I think it's a very important component of the story. I think things are being done to assess the impacts on what you say and illegal activities and corruption and so on. It's how you break that cycle that is the challenging thing. And so, yes, I think people are very well aware of, and this illegal charcoal trading is one such thing. People get a lot of good money for selling their acacia trees through Al-Shabaab to Yemen and so on in East Africa. Much more money than they would make out of livestock and pastoralism and things. So they resort to these kinds of measures. How you break it, I think, should come from incentivization, from kind of proving a concept that, you can move to more sustainable ways of productive living. But I think it's a good question. I think the answer's still out there in terms of how do we break the cycle.